So today I'm here with my good friend Jo, who is currently studying her PhD in sustainable diets. So today we're going to talk about the science behind food and the environment and how eating insects can fit into that. Jo, do you want to just tell us a bit about your background?
My background is in food system sustainability, so looking broadly at kind of the environmental impacts of food. My PhD that I'm studying currently is on sustainable diets and behaviour change. So I'm really trying to understand what it means for us to eat more sustainably and how we can help people to make those changes to their diets.
Sounds great. So I feel like food is always coming up in conversation whenever we talk about the environment or sustainability. Why is food impacting our planet so much?
So actually one of the greatest impacts of our food system comes from the feed that we grow to feed livestock. So this is related to the meat that we eat and meat products and also dairy. Especially in countries like the UK, where we're consuming more than 2.5 times the global average, this is a big problem, and it's leading back to some large impacts on our environment, including nature loss, problems with water pollution and water use, and also land use. Our populations are growing, and actually food security could become a real issue in the future. So there's an argument to say that we should be using that land to feed ourselves, not to feed animals. We can change the systems that we use at the moment to reduce the environmental impact of our food.
So I want to talk now about behaviour change, because this is something that you've studied and I find it a really interesting concept. So what do you think it will take for people to take action and actually change their behaviour regarding what we consume?
That's a great question. I think the first thing when we talk about behaviour is it's really important to understand that our brain almost has two systems, and in behavioural science we refer to this as system 1 and system 2. Now system 1 is fast, it's habitual, it's automatic, it's how we make the majority of our decisions every day, whereas system 2 is much slower. Those are the decisions that you really think about, and those decisions typically take a lot more energy. Most of the decisions we make around food happen under system 1. They're part of habit, they're fast and automatic, which is why actually changing behaviours around food consumption and diet tend to be really, really difficult, because you have to think about how you change some quite ingrained and long-term habits. The other thing about food is that it's super emotional. People have a lot of kind of emotion and feelings connected to their food. It's something that a lot of people love. I know I love to eat and I love food. I think there's kind of quite a lot you need to understand about how people make decisions, but also how they relate to and understand food. What we eat is really influenced by a huge range of factors. Mass advertising, what you see on the TV, what you see on the internet, and ads and things like that can impact what you then choose to buy and eat. Think about when you go into your local supermarket. Everything is as it is for a reason, to try and get people to buy certain products. There have been talk of things like meat taxes and things like that, which would of course have an impact on what food is kind of available and accessible and affordable to people. There's a lot of different things that influence what we eat, and it's about changing all of those so that it's easier, more attractive and more accessible for people to eat healthily and sustainably.
Okay, that's really interesting. Do you think then that it's people's perceptions of what we should be eating that really influence what we choose to eat?
Yeah, definitely. There's a theory called social norms in behavioural science, which describes the influence of the network of people that we surround ourselves with on our behaviours. So whether that's family, whether that's friends, whether that's people we know from work, all these different people that we interact with have an influence on what we choose to eat.
So next I just want to touch on veganism, because it's another thing that always seems to come up in these sorts of conversations. I feel like people are either very for it or quite against it, or just a bit confused by it. So I just want to ask you, what do you think of veganism and its impact on the environment?
So firstly, I think it's important to say that no diet is in itself inherently super healthy and super sustainable. I think the difficulty with things like veganism, vegetarianism, omnivorous diets is that people have these conceptions of these different diets now, that one is kind of definitely better for the environment than another. And we know that on the whole, yes, vegan diets have a lower environmental impact because of the large environmental impact of producing and consuming meat and meat products. but it all depends on what you're eating, the kinds of foods that you're eating, the way you're cooking them, the way they're transported to get to you. And the most important thing is how they're actually being produced. An example of that is that you can have kind of what is actually a relatively unhealthy and unsustainable vegan diet if you're consuming a lot of sugar, a lot of highly processed products that are high in fat, salt and sugar, and perhaps kind of a lot of really highly processed meat alternatives. Now that part of the subject is a bit contentious because these products haven't been around for a very long time, so we're not kind of fully aware of what the environmental impact of them would be if everyone started eating them in the same way that people eat meat today. So, sorry, that was probably a bit of a roundabout answer to a question, Jess, but I think the main thing that I would want people to understand is that no diet is sustainable in and of itself. It all depends on exactly what you're eating and how it's produced. So a vegan diet that's really high in kind of lots of vegetables, kind of quite a lot of local and seasonal food, the two have to go together always, that's great. But yeah, it all depends on exactly what you're eating.
That's really useful to know, and I feel like with so many things within the topic of sustainability and the environment, people kind of think it's just one simple answer, and it never is. So it's really good, I think, to have these discussions and discuss these different topics. So this leads us really nicely onto the main topic of this video. What do you think about the concept of eating insects as a food source? So at the moment, I think for us here in the UK, it's a topic that isn't discussed as much. And I think people's concept of it is often very different to the reality of having insects in your diet. So I just wanted to chat about that and get your views on it.
I think anything that can help us eat more sustainably is something that we should explore, provided that there are no kind of really big unintended consequences that could arise from that. So I think it's potentially a really interesting avenue and something that would allow us to diversify our diets in a kind of sustainable way and potentially reduce our reliance on meat and meat products. There are still quite a few unknowns for me in terms of actually what's going into the production of insects. It's still obviously a really quite small scale industry. So I think there's something in terms of kind of, what are they being fed? How's that feed being produced? What would that industry look like if you scaled it up to provide more food for human consumption? There's quite a few questions that I think need to be answered. The other thing that I quite like is how some really innovative companies are starting to use insects for direct human consumption, but in things such as flour. So they're ground up and they're put into flour. You can't really taste them, and you just go on and use that flour as normal. So I really love things like that, and I'd like to see that becoming more of a norm. From a behaviour change perspective as well, I think some of the real barriers to people eating more insects are that they kind of are not very accepted yet by people. So there's this feeling that they're kind of gross, that I wouldn't want to be eating that. And actually, by grinding them up and putting them in something like a flour, you're not going to notice them. And you also don't really have to change what you're cooking and what you're eating. They just become part of your diet in quite an easy and acceptable way. So I think there's something really interesting in that, and that's something I'd like to see grow over time. Okay,
yeah, that's really interesting to hear. And I guess just like a lot of other food sources and a lot of new ways of doing things at the moment, just as long as we explore it and develop these kind of different alternatives in the right way, then it could be a solution.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Okay. At the moment, with the topics of eating less meat and things like that, people are using the concept of Meatfree Mondays and reducing meat in their diet one day a week if they don't want to completely give up meat. Can you see that working, or would it be a good thing to do if you were, say, to replace meat with insects as a different food source, as an alternative? If maybe people don't want to fully give up meat and they're not too sure about insects yet, is just replacing, say, one meal a week to start with, is that a good option?
I think that's a really interesting question. We don't yet have the research that's looked into that to give us a good answer on actually whether that would be more sustainable or not. I mean, obviously you would think yes it would be, because the impact of producing insects is lower than the impact of producing meat. The issue with things like Meatfree Mondays is that although yes people are cutting meat out from the diet that one day a week, what we often see is they then eat more meat on the other days of the week, so you get what's called a rebound effect, which is obviously not what you want to see from the perspective of looking at the whole diet. You want to see that kind of change over time, rather than just eating less one day a week and then eating more the other days. So I think actually that's what's really interesting about something like insects, depending on how we choose to use them. But actually, I'm quite excited by the prospect that they could be part of this solution from a sustainability perspective. Going back to my example of kind of using insects in flour, that doesn't require people to kind of engage with their system too and make a huge decision about what I'm going to eat and to make that choice. It's something that is quite natural. People aren't required to sort of change their behaviours, but actually what they're eating becomes more sustainable without them having to do anything. So that's what I think is particularly interesting about something like insects, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with that industry over the next sort of 10 years, how that develops, and actually how we can make them part of our diet and how they can potentially replace something like meat, which we know has a very high impact. So I'm personally really excited to see how we can make insects part of this solution, how we can kind of scale up their production, which ways we choose to use them, and especially thinking about the ways that we might use them in our products so that our diets inherently become more sustainable without having to see a huge shift in behaviours, which will of course take longer.
It seems like insects really can be part of a sustainable solution. We just need to do a lot more research and exploration of how this can really work in our diets. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you found it insightful and informative. As always, if you have any questions at all for me or for Joe, just leave them in the comments below and we'll get back to you. And thank you so much, Joe, for joining us.